horizontally everywhere. But it's really to be the role of that sort of trusted advisor early on, and that's way before a crisis starts. I think the importance of really working with the business, understanding, those business goals and objectives, and actually trying to get a seat at the table, not necessarily when you're talking about security or crisis management, those biannual workshops that you might manage to drag a few executives to unwilling and they don't have a lot of time, but actually being around the table and seen as that business lead, someone that can contribute, value add, by the time you get to that crisis, if you've got that right and you've achieved that, then I think the ability to partner cross-functionally and engage with those key stakeholders will be so much easier. And, often the conversation, we have quite a large security team at Google, and there's always that balance. We have the very busy cluster and campus security managers who are dealing with day-to-day security operations and trying to remind me and some of the other security leads how busy they are. They've got the guard force, the physical security, the incident management and day-to-day stuff that they need to focus on. But actually, if they can apportion 30% of their time or 20% of their time getting to those key meetings and building those relationships with the local leadership, then I think that will help and dividends when it comes to that core crisis piece. And so really building in those communication and those relationship skills, aside from that sort of core security delivery, for me is something that you've got to focus on. And it might be a case of changing the culture within your own individual business. That takes time. Not everybody wants a security representative at the table at some of these key conversations on business product rollouts or whatever it might be. But I think if you can succeed in that, then you're far more likely to succeed in the kind of crisis management side of things.
Thank you, Jude. Eleanor, maybe you could tell us more about how you instill a culture of crisis readiness within a company. How does training or scenario planning play a role into that? And maybe you could give us also a sense of whether this varies regionally, even within the same company.
Absolutely, thank you. So I suppose the first thing to note is that there is no one-size-fits-all model for every organisation when it comes to crisis preparedness. There are definitely some key principles and guidelines that we can take through. So the first, you've mentioned leadership and stakeholder engagement, but that leadership commitment to the crisis management program is very much key. So ensuring that leadership are committed to engaging with, whether that's a specific crisis management policy or the overall engagement with the security team, that's critical. And also key to that is that leaders having that level of being able to lead with a sense of calm, being able to engage during a crisis and lead us through it. And that's very critical. Again, when we talk to partnership, is that security and crisis management professionals are seen as partners and are able to kind of lead in parallel in one of those scenarios. Secondly, I would highlight that crisis management frameworks and policies need to actually respond to the actual business requirements. It's very easy to go away and sit in a room as a security and crisis management team and write a policy which isn't necessarily fit for purpose. So make sure that it's process embedded and reflects the organisation's needs. And also, we mentioned training being foundational, but I really would emphasise the idea that we have to understand that resilience is everybody's business. So it goes throughout all employees. They need to be conscious and aware of how they would respond during incidents, but particularly for our leadership, how they are prepared throughout annual training to be able to respond. I'm going to stop right now.
Yeah, let's pass it over to Ben. Thank you for that, Eleanor. So Ben, if you could help us bring this all together and conclude this section. With your experience in defense, how do you balance the preparation part with the flexibility needed to address unpredictable situations?
So I think they're two sides of the same coin, and I'm going to pick up one or two things that both Jude and Elle have said. So the first thing, and I'm sort of reminded of of something my father told me, funny enough. It was just an experience that he had when he was working for a British airline back in the 70s and 80s. And they were about to be privatised, and they were inspected by a management consultant. And the management consultancy firm came in and they said, "You people are the best we have ever seen on crisis management. We've never seen anyone quite so good and fast and slick at managing crises as you." And they all sort of puffed themselves up and said, "Well, that's great." And then they hit them with a killer blow, as consultants do, which is, "And the reason is you're good is because you have so many of them. And the reason you have so many of them is because your governance and your processes either don't exist or aren't really followed or aren't understood." So I think that preparation in terms of governance and processes and using them actually prevents you from having crises in the first place, so there's a bit of flexibility there. I think the second thing, and again, Jude spoke a lot about the sort of teams and peoples and behaviours, but we all do general operations, day-to-day business, the daily grind, and in that you'll have events, you'll have challenges. And the way as a leader, you deal with your team, you empower your team, you use things like mission command, you encourage a team of teams approach and lateral communications, you identify, as Eleanor says, the people who can work well under pressure and are resilient. The more you do that in the day-to-day run of the business and cope with those small challenges, the better you'll be able to be at going as a team from walk to sprint. So how you manage your team is hugely important. Creating that culture and atmosphere has to be done during the routine operations. And then I think the third thing, and again, trying a little bit with what Elle was saying about getting distracted or distracting people, is a crisis isn't just something that affects money, people, and assets. A crisis can be a crisis if it takes you off your strategic objectives, your medium and long-term goals. It'll always disrupt the short-term day. But if you allow crises, particularly compounded crises, to stop you from being able to achieve your medium and long-term things, then you've exacerbated the problem. And I can remember a British brigade in Helmand, which was very good at dealing with crises, but they actually didn't have a strong vision, didn't have strong, clear objectives that were understood at the strategic level by everyone. And they just allowed themselves to get blown off course their campaign to a certain degree. So I think those three things kind of wrap it together.
Thank you, Ben. So preparation obviously is key, but the crisis will hit at some point, and the spotlight is now on leaders to manage the situation as smoothly and swiftly as possible, rapid decision making, keeping team cohesion, and hopefully maintaining operations while managing the crisis. So moving on to the second part of how do we manage during crises. Eleanor, maybe I'll start with you as a crisis manager. Tell me a bit more about the frameworks and the principles that you apply during crises.
Sure, thanks. See if the voice works. So at MasterCard we use the ICS, so Instant Command System Framework, or in the UK that would be your Bronze, Silver, Gold framework. It's great to have all these names and best practice, but the reality is you must ensure there's a clear command and control structure in place, and this needs to obviously be in place prior to an incident occurring. I think the key point for any policy or plan here is that there's a structured approach to managing the incident and a structured approach to decision making. So to speak specifically to that, recognizing how MasterCard approach this is that we have a layered approach from an office response team through regional up to commercial response teams, and we have very clear crisis commanders for each of those response teams. And that means we've already identified who is the ultimate decision maker and who has the authority in a situation. So that's all guided through, and obviously the crisis manager is there to then support that process. I think the key thing here is, as security professionals, as crisis management professionals, how do we bring the assuredness that there's one voice and one structured response, and that really looks at how we communicating throughout an incident, ensuring that we communicate with transparency to build the trust that we just discussed. Equally taking the point to pause and say, are we risking over communicating at this point? I think particularly in this day and age, we have, the reality is we can share information in real time, social media externally, internally, even for teams being, we have to make sure that we're controlling the narrative, bringing that one picture, and then supporting our stakeholders and being able to bring decision-making authority to the management of the situation.
Obviously, a lot of risks there, and then maybe you could tell us in high-stakes situations, how do you manage the risks of quick decision-making? How do you mitigate that?
So I think the biggest risk that impacts on decision making is a failure to understand the problem and the event in the first place. And so, many people will have heard the Einstein quote about if you've got a complex problem and you've got an hour to solve it, spend 55 minutes trying to understand the problem and then try and spend the last 5 minutes solving it. And as decision makers and the staff that support the decision makers, we're bad at understanding things. And particularly in a crisis where you've got lots of data points, you've got misinformation, you've got disinformation, emotions are probably running high, particularly if it's impacting your staff personally. People fall into analytical traps, don't they? The ones that I've experienced the most have been anchoring, and I've probably been prey to them myself. Anchoring, so you make an assessment and you find it difficult to get off that assessment, even when new data's coming in. And the second one that again I reflect I've probably fallen foul of, and others I've seen have as well, is mirroring. We look at the world and we assume that adversaries and clients and stakeholders and our own staff all think the same way and behave the same way that we do, and they don't. So understanding that there's these kind of understand traps, these analytical traps you can fall into as a decision maker is kind of the first step. And you can mitigate that risk by having things that are called structured analytic techniques, so having a red team, having someone, maybe it's your deputy, you can play that adversarial role and challenge your assumptions, get you to write your assumptions down and so forth and put a checklist against them, and just make sure that the decisions you're making are based on an understanding that is backed up and tested really well. And adaptable as events and new data comes in.
And you talk about adaptability, and I guess besides being complex, crisis situations are often dynamic, and you need to keep your team adaptable and flexible. Jude, can you tell us more about how do you do that? How do you keep the team agile and responsive?
Well, it's definitely challenging, and again, I sort of mentioned I've been at Google 2.5 years now, and I sat and thought about how many crises there's been in that time, and I think it's fair to say there's been quite a few, certainly in this part of the world. We've had everything from earthquakes in Morocco, floods in Libya, earthquakes in Turkey, a small Middle Eastern crisis, Ukraine, Russia continues. And I think it's fair to say it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're almost in this weird kind of business as usual crisis management now. And, if I use one example of the Middle Eastern crisis, we have a range of offices in Israel, we have data centres there, we have several thousand workers. The immediate impact of that moment, 14, 15 months ago now, was startling. And look, I'm not in the military anymore, I'm not 24/7, even though I'm sure my boss would have it that way sometimes. And normally these events always happen on a weekend. I'm stood by the rugby field watching my boys play rugby, and the call goes, and you don't really understand, obviously, in that moment, what this is and how long this is going to go on for. And so I think thinking very early on about that resilience piece within your own team is absolutely vital. And in order to do that, it's not a simple case of just kind of, having a roster or having a rota, which frankly might be, very impractical for your business depending on your resources or how big your team is. But making sure that in the day-to-day operations, again going back to before that moment of crisis, you're working collaboratively across teams so people can jump in, they can step in and think about different roles is really important. And so we work with our colleagues in APAC and in North America too. We try and create that resilient process in terms of our Global Security Operations Centre, making sure that people understand that regional dynamic, having our cluster and campus security managers, some may be based in London or Dublin Dublin, elsewhere, and can they help? Can they support? Because actually, the phases of a crisis change, and again, to use Israel, those first few hours, days, it was all about getting people out of country that are not normally present, evacuation, life safety, that kind of core business, as you would expect. Beyond that, we're then having people that are mobilised. We're thinking about our offices. But again, Google being Google, it's not a normal company. We have products. What are we thinking about when it comes to Google Maps and traffic clearing? Do we want a red route when missiles are flying in? How are we uploading details around blood banks or emergency shelters, and being equitable outside Israel where maybe the information isn't there that we need? What about ads that are being loaded on search, or videos being uploaded onto YouTube, Android? There's all sorts of considerations, and we're not machines, we're not robots, so we need to make sure that resilience is there, so you can really support that, not just in the short term, but in the medium to long term, and understand, where you're at in that crisis and how that crisis is evolving. Does the cadence need to change, the regular meetings and all that kind of stuff? I think just one further point, and it's to state that, as perhaps the obvious, and Ben, you mentioned it, mission command, borrowing the word from the military, but I think you've absolutely got to empower your staff at the lowest level, and I think if you've brought in the right people, they're trained, that the skill set is there, then let's not block them from getting on and being agile and making the decisions that they need to make. There's nothing worse than in a crisis everything's pending and holding because one person needs to say yes. So you need to make sure that culture is there and people are confident to make the decisions they need to make.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Actually, that's the first time I hear the word mission command used.
Very familiar in the British Army.
Hold on.
All right, and that moves us to our third part of the panel, where we talk about what happens post-crisis. So obviously every crisis leaves behind some lessons that we can take, integrate into future plans, and hopefully learn and benefit from. Ben, maybe from your defense and intelligence background, can you share some valuable security lessons learned from actual real-life situations?
So I'll stick with one, and it comes from Afghanistan in 2012. And some of you may recall in 2012 there was an occasion where some American guards at the detention facility in Bagram, where a number of Taliban fighters were being incarcerated, noticed that they were passing around copies of the Quran, and they were writing in the Quran, and they were using it to pass amongst the prisoners. The American guards saw this, confiscated the Qurans, and then desecrated the Qurans by burning them. Well, as you can imagine, the whole of Afghanistan quickly found out and went into uproar, and the pattern of violence across the country changed, and you had cities like Herat and Mazar-Sharif and others that were exploded into civil disobedience, alongside all the other problems that Afghanistan was facing at that time. I was the chief intelligence officer at the time in Kabul for an American general. I was only the chief because the real chief had gone on R&R, which is life, isn't it? But over that sort of week period, there were a couple of things that really stuck with me. The first is, whilst we spent a bit of time moving troops around the country, moving intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets around the country so that we could either understand or control the violence spreading, we spent far more time actually communicating to people. That included, of course, our own kind of command network underneath, but it included the Afghan people. It included the government of Afghanistan, including Karzai. It included the troop contributing nations who wanted to know what was going on. And it included lots of important stakeholders, particularly the aid agencies, who rightly were fearful for their own security. And that communication wasn't just a blanket communication. It had to be well calibrated, well tailored to each of those audience groups. And we spent more time doing that than actually moving ISR around, moving troops around, which perhaps is because of strategic headquarters. But I think communication is the big kind of lesson that I always learn when you're in a crisis, and the effort you have to put on it.
Thank you for that. Eleanor, can you tell us more about some strategies that you might have used to turn crisis challenges into opportunities for long-term improvement?
Absolutely. So I think one of the key things is obviously to have a formalised after-action review process, so your AAR. It's very easy when you're handling an incident, particularly as we said, this is a very dynamic region, we're often handling crises, so we have to make sure that we are formalising that process so we really handle that last part of an incident response, and making sure that you are collaborating, all stakeholders who are engaged, involved in the incident, are brought